Hello students, this is Dr. Neha Agarwal and I am here to solve the AIMS May 2019 ophthalmology questions for you. So let's start with the first one. The figure is shown here and they'd asked what should not be done in this patient. Now as you can see, there is a iron nail which is penetrating inside the cornea. So clearly this is a case of penetrating trauma. The options are visual acuity test, removal of the foreign body, primary survey or the antibiotics. Now the answer here is the removal of foreign body. What should not be done is the removal of foreign body just now here. Now let us see why this happens actually. The answer to this is that not removing the foreign body. For this, let us see what actually trauma does to the eye. Now, whenever trauma occurs in the eye, first of all, trauma is a very important thing and it is actually the most common cause of the low vision in India. I know you must be thinking that this must be refractive errors. I am talking about the developing countries especially. The most common cause of low vision, especially the developing countries, and that too especially in the unilateral. Most common cause of low vision in one eye, unilateral low vision in India, especially in developing countries, which is much more common in males in comparison to females in the ratio 4:1. And when you will compare in the different age groups, about more than 50% you will get that it is occurring less than 25 years of age. So in the children, in the young adults, it is more common. About 34% is occurring in the children. And there was also a survey which showed that this was actually more common in the lower socio-economic status. They are having less awareness, less of personal care, and it was seen. These are the important data which we have got from the Indian statistics, that it's more common in males, more common in the younger age group, as well as children, as well as the lower socioeconomic status, right? Now we can divide this trauma, basically we can divide this trauma into two types. One is your closed globe injury. One is the closed globe injury and another is the open globe injury, right? Now closed globe injury, what do you mean by the closed globe injury? Closed globe injury means that the corneoscleral plane is actually the intact. So if the corneoscleral plane, that is the integrity of this corneoscleral plane is intact, then I will say that it's a closed globe injury, and this will actually include the blunt trauma. Now you must be knowing that it is this blunt trauma which is most common trauma in the eye, and when I say blunt trauma, I can't resist myself in telling about the rosette cataract, yes, because fancy names of the cataract are often asked, and the cataract that you get by the blunt trauma is actually the rosette cataract, the star-shaped cataract. While on the other hand, I am here more interested in the open globe injury, because the visual that is shown is actually showing you the open globe injury where we have actually penetrating trauma. Now either it can be a penetrating trauma or it can be a perforating trauma. When we say that it's a open globe injury, it can be a penetrating trauma or it can be a perforating trauma. Now what is the basic difference between a penetrating trauma and a perforating trauma? In the penetrating trauma, only the entry wound. We just have the entry wound in the penetrating trauma. But in the perforating trauma, we have both, that is entry and the exit wounds. So if you have two wounds, both entry and the exit wound, that means through and through rupture has been there. But if you have just the entry wound, suppose I take the example of a gunshot injury, a bullet will penetrate, it is present inside the vitreous, cavity, that it means it's a penetrating trauma. But if the bullet has gone and it has made through and through rupture, then it will be a case of the perforating trauma. And then third thing can be your intraocular foreign body. This is actually the intraocular foreign body. So whenever we have open globe injuries, one thing that can be found is either it has penetrated or it has gone through and through perforating, or the intraocular foreign body is lying inside. So three important things, like in this case they had shown a iron nail, it has penetrated. Now intraocular foreign body, if you talk about this intraocular foreign body, you must know what is the most common intraocular foreign body. The most common intraocular foreign body is actually the chisel and hammer. Chisel and hammer is the most common intraocular foreign body that is found in the people, and chisel and hammer are nothing but the chips of the iron. Chips of iron are the most common intraocular foreign body which is found in India, and as you know, iron is actually magnetic, so this will present me the magnetic foreign body, and because it is magnetic foreign body, therefore MRI is contraindicated. Now can you see a series of questions? They can ask you most common intraocular foreign body, it's a magnetic foreign body, and MRI should be contraindicated. So what should be the best investigation? Now two important questions. What should be the best investigation for the localization of this foreign body? When I am saying that MRI is contraindicated, then what is the other one that I can go for, and what is for measuring the visual acuity? For the localization, because CT scan is contraindicated, go for the localization, go for the CT scan, not the ultrasound. It is a CT scan which is better. I know MRI is even better for the localization, but because it's a magnetic foreign body, you cannot do the MRI. Next best is the CT scan. And as far as the visual acuity is concerned, the best is the electroretinography, that is ERG. So these are very important MCQs, 5 MCQs on the go just from the intraocular foreign body, the most common foreign body. It is magnetic, MRI contraindicated, and then CT scan and the ERG. Right. Now if you go with the effects of the penetrating trauma, because once you know the effects of the penetrating trauma, only then we will decide actually the do's and don'ts of this penetrating trauma, what should be the do's and what should be the don'ts. Now this penetrating trauma, as soon as it is piercing, it is penetrating the eye, the first important thing it can cause is actually the laceration. Laceration can occur in the lid, laceration can occur in the conjunctiva, laceration can also occur in the cornea. So in the first go, you can see if there is any laceration from the lid to the conjunctiva to the cornea, because it is penetrating inside, right? Now because then it is going inside, you can also get the hemorrhages, you can get corneal blood staining, you can also get the subconjunctival hemorrhages. Then what to tell about the posterior segment? Posteriorly, it can cause the vitreous hemorrhage, and if you remember, as I always say, that though the most common cause of vitreous hemorrhage is spontaneous vitreous hemorrhage, yet out of the known causes, trauma is the most common cause out of the known causes, not only in adults but also in the children. Then if you go more posteriorly, there can even the retinal detachment. Now retinal detachment in the long run can also cause the cataract. Now bleeding can also cause the glaucoma. So this patient who is actually having the penetrating trauma can have lacerations, hemorrhages, can have the vitreous hemorrhage, can have the retinal detachment. Retinal detachment in turn can lead to cataract, and there are so many hemorrhages. Then there can be uveitis, inflammation, and even this inflammation can also lead to glaucoma. Now in short, if I ask you what are the major dangers of penetrating trauma, I am concerned about the infection, because a foreign body, something from outside is going inside. So I am always worried about the endophthalmitis. that this patient is at risk of endophthalmitis, so what I will do, I will start the antibiotics at the earliest. I will start the antibiotics at the earliest because I am actually worried about the infection. Number 2, I am also worried about uveitis because this penetrating trauma will start the inflammation, and especially which uveitis, actually I am worried about the sympathetic ophthalmitis. You know, sympathetic ophthalmitis is actually again a ophthalmic emergency, and here the trauma occurs in one eye, but inflammation will go and move on to the other eye also, and that is why the eye which suffers from trauma is called as the exciting eye. That is called as the exciting eye. Other eye also develops the inflammation. That eye is actually called as sympathizing eye. That eye is called as sympathizing eye. So this eye is actually sympathizing with the exciting eye. That is why it is called as sympathetic ophthalmitis. The most commonly accepted theory. The most commonly accepted theory for this sympathetic ophthalmitis is again the allergic theory, because there is no infection here. How will you actually show the involvement of the other eye? How we can justify the involvement of the other eye, usually which takes place in about 4 to 8 weeks, that is your allergy. Now, sympathetic ophthalmitis is a rare entity, but it is very commonly asked in your exam, so you should know about it. What are the earliest symptoms? If you see the earliest symptoms of the sympathetic ophthalmitis, then because it's an inflammatory disease, we have actually photophobia. Along with this, we also have transient weakening of the accommodation. We also have transient weakening of the accommodation. Now, actually, why we have weakening of accommodation? We have weakening of accommodation because here trauma occurs, basically sympathetic ophthalmitis occurs due to trauma to the ciliary body. Now, if you remember, this ciliary body is called as dangerous zone of the eyeball. It is called as dangerous zone of the eyeball. So, like we have the dangerous area of the face, similarly we have the dangerous area of the eyeball. So, whenever we have trauma, penetrating trauma or the perforating trauma to the ciliary body, which is called as the dangerous zone of the eyeball, there are chances of sympathetic ophthalmitis. From one eye it is going to the other eye, from exciting eye it is going to sympathizing eye in about 4 to 8 weeks with the earliest symptoms of photophobia and transient weakening of accommodation. The type of uveitis that we get here is granulomatous. It is not only granulomatous, but also it is panuveitis. Granulomatous, panuveitis we are getting. If you see the signs, in the signs, the earliest sign that we get is actually the retrolental flare. It is the retrolental flare that we are getting, while the most important one, the most important sign that we are getting is the Dehlen-Fuch nodules. Now, you have to be very careful here. In cases of anterior uveitis, it was aqueous flare and the KPs, while here we are having the retrolental flare and the Dehlen-Fuch nodules. Now, one of the most important thing is the treatment. How to treat this sympathetic ophthalmitis? What you have to do actually, first you have to repair the perforation. Whenever there is perforation, that is always an emergency and you have to actually repair it at any cost. After you have repaired it, then we can start with the drug of choice. We can give the steroids. Steroids are always contraindicated in cases of perforation. So don't ever give the steroids till you have repaired the perforation. Then we can start with the steroids, and third very important thing is visual acuity. They have given what should not be taken. You have to take this visual acuity. Take the visual acuity as accurately as possible. As accurately as possible, you have to measure the visual acuity, and in which eye you are seeing? In the exciting eye. Assess the vision in the exciting eye. See the maximum amount of vision that is possible in this eye, and see if there is a hope of useful vision. See if there is a hope of the useful vision in this eye. If there is a hope of useful vision, if it is yes, then you continue what you were doing, that is the conservative management. Continue with the conservative management. But if it is no, if it is no, then what should be your treatment of choice? In that case, the treatment of choice is actually enucleation. Why enucleation? Why I want to now enucleate the eye? Now the treatment of choice is enucleation, because if I do not have any hope of saving the vision in this eye, at least I should save the other eye so that the other eye does not develop the uveitis, and therefore do it within 2 weeks, because within 4 to 8 weeks this uveitis has a possibility of spreading in the other eye. So if you want to do enucleation, if you are taking the decision of the destructive procedure, always take an early decision and do it within 2 weeks. So this was sympathetic ophthalmitis. Now, because there are chances of uveitis, there are chances of infection, and third important thing was the intraocular foreign body. There is a chance, if you remember, I told you that whenever we are penetrating trauma, I am actually afraid of infection and ophthalmitis. That is why I was starting with the antibiotics. I have to do primary survey. I have to check the visual acuity, because there is a chance of sympathetic ophthalmitis, and then there will be an intraocular foreign body also inside. Now, what are actually the do's and the don'ts? First, I will discuss the don'ts, because don'ts are always more important than the do's. Never do the don'ts in case. Now, what are the don'ts? First of all, don't touch the eye. Now, this is the most important thing. We usually have to follow a no touch technique. I know that it looks difficult sometimes, that a patient is having pain, you see a foreign body lying inside, and the first temptation that comes in your mind is removing that foreign body. But I will say that don't touch the eye. Don't, second thing, don't rub the eye. Don't touch the eye, don't rub the eye, even don't put pressure on the eye. Don't put any sort of the pressure on the eye. We actually want to take a no touch technique, and a very important thing is don't remove the foreign body. Actually take a very conservative approach, unnecessary putting the pressure, rubbing, touching, removing the foreign body. Don't do anything. And then I will say that don't irrigate. Don't irrigate with any fluid other than it can be normal saline or the warm water. It's best that you don't do anything, but even if you feel like that it's very severe and you may require washing, then don't do it with anything which is other than normal saline or the warm water. Don't touch it, don't rub it, don't pressure it, don't cover it. Usually I will not advise you to even cover it, but if you feel it's very severe, there are chances of infection, and I know that infection is a very important sequelae. We are always doubtful about endophthalmitis. Then you can put a loose cup over the eye. So what we can do for that? What are the do's actually? First of all, do the external examination. Don't touch, but do just the external examination. Try to see what are the consequences that has taken place. Secondly, you can actually irrigate, and I told you that if you feel like, don't irrigate with any other thing apart from the normal saline, apart from the water. So use either the normal saline or we can use the warm water. Don't use any other thing. Third thing about the covering. I told you not to cover it, but if you feel like that there are chances of infection and patient has to go a long way. So what you can do, if you are covering, take any loose cup, like you must have seen those green shields that we give after the cataract surgery, the cups kind of thing, you can give that, or if you don't have that, then we can even use the moist pad. Use the moist pad and the loose bandage. Moist pad and the loose bandage can be used. Don't put it very hard, don't put it very hard, don't do it. Just a moist pad of pad can be applied and a very loose bandage. Then fourth, take the visual acuity. I told you, you have to measure the visual acuity as accurately as possible. You can even use the ERG, that is good. And then you can do those tests which are actually involving the no touch technique. I can do the slit lamp examination. I can even go for direct ophthalmoscopy. For the indirect ophthalmoscopy, I can go for the B scan, so that you can come to know about the vitreous hemorrhage, the RD, other things. But so that will include your primary survey also, that will include your antibiotics also, that will include your visual acuity. But don't ever try to remove the foreign body. Yes, you have to remove it, but once you are already fixed with everything, you are all set in the OT, ready to do, only then you have to remove. Now why? Why you don't want to remove the foreign body? Because as soon as you remove the foreign body, there will be a perforation there. So now aqueous humor can come out, a sudden collapse of the angle of anterior chamber can take place, flat anterior chamber can take place, and there are so many other complications. Iris prolapse can happen. Now then chances of infection even becomes more, and that is why the answer to this question should be removal of the foreign body. You should not go for the removal of the foreign body. Now coming to the next important question, they have given you a visual and they are asking what is the test done here. They have given the options, the color vision. For color vision, the most commonly that we use are the Ishara's color plates. They give you the numbers, it is not there. Strabismus, not at all, it is not for strabismus. So answer here is actually this stereopsis test. Now let us see something about this stereopsis test actually. How to do this test and what is actually the name of this test. The name of this test is actually the stereofly test, and the stereofly test is actually done for the stereopsis. Now what is actually stereopsis? The 3D perception, third dimensional perception, or I can say it is actually the depth perception. 3D perception or the depth perception is actually the stereopsis, and the person who gave the concept of this stereopsis was the Charles Wheatstone. Now if you want to remember just one name, don't learn Charles, learn Wheatstone, because there are so many Charles in the ophthalmology only, and when they will ask you, I am sure they will give you Charles in all the 4 options, so you have to be actually clearing from this surname. So if you want to remember just single name, learn it from Wheatstone. Now stereopsis is the third dimensional perception. We also know that it takes a very long period for the development. It starts at, this stereopsis starts at about 6 to 8 months, while for its completion it takes a very long time, and it completes at about 6 to 7 years. So obviously a very long time, and this is also the age of the emetropia. So by the time the child becomes emetropic, he also develops the stereopsis and binocular single vision develops there. That reminds me of binocular single vision, a very beautiful concept in ophthalmology, the binocular single vision. Now, binocular single vision means whenever you visualize any object, whenever we visualize any object, the image is formed on retina of both the eyes. But still we see one single image because our retina is fusing them and making it one. That is called as binocular single vision, and there are actually 3 grades of this binocular single vision. The 3 grades are: first is the simultaneous perception. You should be able to see both the images simultaneously. That is actually called as simultaneous perception. Then our retina should fuse them. So second will be the fusion, and then third will be the stereopsis, where now the child or the patient will get the third dimensional aspect or the depth perception of this. So the 3 grades of binocular single vision is the simultaneous perception, the fusion and the stereopsis, and this test is basically for the stereopsis. So I told you the name was the stereo fly test. Now what happens here? Here we have 3D polarized vectograph, and here a booklet is given to the patient. This booklet consists of the 2 sides, right, and the patient will wear the polarized glasses. Here the patient is given polarized glasses to wear, and one by one he will be coming to both the sides of this vectograph, and you are measuring it in the seconds of the arc. You have to measure it in the seconds of the arc. Now if you see it on the right side, if you see on the right side, you will see that a housefly is there. You ask the patient to wear these glasses, and then you ask the patient to hold the wings of this housefly. Now if stereopsis is there, depth perception is there, then the patient will actually hold the wings above this book somewhere here. While if the patient is not having stereopsis, it's a flat vision, then the patient will just touch the wings on the surface and not above it. So if this is the housefly and the patient is holding wings here, that means stereopsis is there. But if the patient is holding just at this surface, that means no stereopsis. This is for the right side. Now if you see on the left side, on the left side we have got series of circles in the various rhomboids, and then we also have this animals which are there. Animals are actually used for the small children, and the circles can be used for the adults also. In each of the rhomboid we have got 4 circles, and you have to ask the patient that which of the circle looks elevated. So in every circle, like plate 1, plate 2, plate 3, like this we have, he will tell that which circle is elevated. So there are 3 series of tests in this single housefly stereo test, which will help you in the assessment of the stereopsis. So the answer of this question will be the C, stereopsis test. Now the next question is, the image is given here, and they say that it is related to Marcus-Gunn pupil, the optic neuritis, the Robertson-Agel pupil, or the pinpoint pupil. Here the answer is your Marcus-Gunn pupil. Now let us see how. If you see here, in the first instance they are saying that there is no light. Now when there is no light, the pupils are dilated, they are normal, because you know by default the pupils are always dilated. The pupil always constrict due to some stimulus. This stimulus can be light, it can be accommodation, or it can be convergence. No stimulus, no convergence, no constriction, and therefore dilatation. Now when we are showing the light to the normal eye, what will happen? When I am showing the light to the normal eye, what will happen? From the retina, it will go to the optic nerve. Now because there is no defect in this optic nerve, it will go up to the pretectal nucleus. From pretectal nucleus, it will go to the EW nucleus of both the sides, third nerve of both the sides, ganglion of both the sides. Which ganglion? Ciliary ganglion, and therefore the muscles of both the sides and both the muscles, both the pupils will constrict. On this side it will be direct light reflex, while on the other side it will be the indirect light reflex. Now what I am doing? I am swinging my hand to the abnormal eye. When I swing my hand from normal to abnormal eye, now the affected optic nerve comes in the picture. This affected optic nerve will not take the impulse up to the pretectal nucleus, neither to the EW nucleus of either side, third nerve of either side, therefore ganglion of either side, and therefore the muscles of either side. So what will happen? No direct light reflex. No direct light reflex on the affected side. There will be no direct light reflex as well as no indirect light reflex. This is called as RAPD, or the Marcus gun pupil. That is why the answer was the Marcus gun pupil. Now let us see what is this Marcus gun pupil actually. The Marcus gun pupil, which is also called as RAPD. Now what happens here? It is called as RAPD. The other name is the Marcus gun pupil, right? Now what is the full form here? It is the relative afferent pupillary defect. Relative afferent pupillary defect. Now when I am saying that it's an afferent defect, that means defect is actually lying in the optic nerve. What is the afferent nerve in the pupillary reflex pathway? It is the optic nerve. While the efferent nerve is the third nerve, afferent nerve is actually the optic nerve. Now what will happen in this RAPD or the Marcus gun pupil? This is actually tested by, it is tested by the swinging flashlight test. Swinging flashlight test. Now what is the swinging flashlight test? Suppose these are the eyes where pupils are showing you normal because there is no stimulus here, right? Now when I show the light, suppose this is the normal eye and this is the affected eye, right? Now what is happening when I am showing the light to the normal eye? When I am showing the light to the normal eye, both the reflexes will come. Direct light reflex on the side where I am showing the reflex, while the other side will show the indirect light reflex. Why it is coming? Because when you show the light to the normal eye, this optic nerve is intact. It is taking the stimulus to the pretectal nucleus and therefore EW nucleus of both the sides. But when you show the light to the affected side, when you show the light to the affected side, because this nerve is intact, now what will happen? Neither the direct light reflex will come nor the indirect light reflex. Now the absence of the reflexes will lead to dilatation of the pupil. So here this is actually called as the RAPD present, that is Marcus gun pupil, and though the exact reason is not known, it is not just the absence of the constriction, it is actually paradoxical dilatation. Paradoxical dilatation of the pupils, paradoxical dilatation of the pupils that we are getting on both the sides. Now why actually this happens? For this you have to see the pathway of the light reflex. The pathway of the light reflex obviously will start with the light. Light will fall on the retina. From the retina, this will go to the optic nerve. From the optic nerve, this will go to the optic tract, and from the optic tract, it will go to the pretectal nucleus. Now from this pretectal nucleus, it will go to the EW nucleus of both the sides, EW nucleus here and the EW nucleus of here. That means in the right eye also and in the left eye also. From this it will go to the third nerve of both the sides. From third nerve it will go to the ciliary ganglion. Ciliary ganglion of both the sides, and from the ciliary ganglion it is going to the muscles, that is sphincter pupillae muscles. Sphincter pupillae muscles. That means when you are showing the light to the right eye, now the right will get the direct light reflex and left will get the indirect light reflex. But when I am showing the light to the left eye, now left will get the direct light reflex and right will get the indirect light reflex. So actually it is this bilateral innervation which is the basis of the indirect light reflex. So optic nerve is the afferent nerve here. If it is intact, then you will get both the direct as well as indirect. But if this is affected, neither the direct nor the indirect. Right. Now if you see the pathway of the accommodation reflex, the pathway of the accommodation reflex, then this is actually same as light reflex pathway. It is same as the light reflex pathway except for one thing, that is lateral geniculate body, which is instead of pretectal nucleus. Everything is same, only lateral geniculate body instead of the pretectal nucleus. So when there is a lesion of the pretectal nucleus, light reflex will be absent but accommodation reflex is present. So this is actually the basis of, this is the basis of the Argyll-Robertson pupil. Argyll-Robertson pupil. So while the question that was shown to us, the question that was shown to us was this one, where the image is showing the normal response to light and positive RAPT. RAPT is also called as the Marcus Gunn pupil. It is the earliest indication of the optic nerve disease, and it is also called as Marcus Gunn pupil. It is tested by the swinging flashlight test. It is not the pinpoint pupil, rather it is a dilatation of the pupils. It is not the Argyll-Robertson pupil, which is a lesion of the pretectal nucleus. It is actually the Marcus Gunn pupil. Now coming to yet another question. Here they say that the young male is unevenly operated for the IOL implantation. So when it should be removed? It should be removed in cases of PCO. Yes, it can be removed if there is posterior capsular opacification. It should never be removed. This is wrong. It should be removed. So this will be wrong. It can be removed. It should be removed when presbyopia sets in. This is again wrong. Due to presbyopia, we are not removing the IOLs. It should be changed after the 10 years. No, this is not a criteria that this should be actually changed after 10 years. So the correct answer is that it should be removed in cases of posterior capsular opacification. Here I have tried to given up you a list why we remove the intraocular lenses. If there is uveitis, if there is dystrophy, uncontrollable glaucoma, especially the anterior chamber IOLs are very frequently notoriously causing glaucoma. If there is a pupillary sphincter, if we have decentration, if there is subluxation, if there is dislocation, if there is rubeosus iridis, tumors and ophthalmitis, these are very, very common causes for the IOL removal. Now one very important thing is how and why actually this PCO occurs. PCO actually means the posterior capsular opacification. It is the posterior capsular opacification. and it is also called as secondary cataract or the after cataract. It is also called as secondary cataract or the after cataract. Plus it is actually the most common late post-operative complication. Now when I am saying it is late, that means it is occurring after months. It is occurring after months. The complications are intraoperative, early post-operative and the late post-operative. Now why there is PCO and when does it occurs? There are so many actually factors which are responsible for this PCO, but one of the very important factors is the age of the patient. Age of the patient, then the material of the IOL that you have applied, then chronic diseases, diabetes, hypertension. It also depends upon uh, the type of IOL, material of IOL, as well as the style, as well as the design of the IOL that you are applying. And as far as the age is concerned, it's very common in the young patients. It is very, very common in the young patients because in these young patients, the rate of proliferation on the lens epithelial cells, LECs means the lens epithelial cells. Now when you are suppose operating on this lens, there was an anterior capsule and there was a posterior capsule also. Now what we are doing, we are removing this anterior capsule, we are removing this lens also, and we are leaving behind this posterior capsule on which we have to actually place this IOL. So after some time there can be proliferation on this lens epithelial cells and there can be development of opacification of this posterior capsule due to the proliferation of the lens epithelial cells. This proliferation can actually take place in two forms. Either there can be Somering's ring cataract or there can be the Elshing's pearl cataract. Somering's ring cataract or the Elshing's pearl cataract. The Somering's ring cataract actually occurs in a ring shaped manner. You will have opacification in the form of a ring, while if you see the Elshing's pearl cataract, in the Elshing's pearl cataract, suppose this is the IOL here you have the vacuolated cells kind of a thing is formed in the central area. These are called as the vacuolated cells. So both of them, whether it is the Somering's ring cataract or it is the Elshing's pearl cataract, both will actually lead to the diminution of vision and you have to treat them. The treatment is same in both the cases, and what you have to do is the laser posterior capsulotomy. Laser posterior capsulotomy. TOMI means what? TOMI means the opening. We have to create an opening in the posterior capsule with the help of a laser. The laser that we use here is the Andy Yag laser. That is your neodymium yttrium, aluminium garnet. Neodymium yttrium aluminium garnet. This is the full form of this laser. 1064 nanometer, and the type of laser is the photo-disruptive laser. You have to be very careful about the type of the laser as well. It is the photo-disruptive laser. The name of the laser, the full form, the wavelength, the type of lasers, all are very, very important. They are used for the cutting. They are used as a photo-disruptive laser. Now, why we are actually trying to remove the posterior capsule in cases of PCO in the young patients, as in this question? Actually, the treatment that we are giving here, this also leads to several complications, right? plus the chances, the risk of PCO is very high in these patients. So it's always better to prevent the PCO rather than having this PCO and then try to remove it. The chances of PCO are very high, the complications are very high. That is why you must be knowing that in cases of juvenile chronic arthritis or the juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, where uveitis is occurring in less than 16 years of age, the IOLs are contraindicated. I always tell this in your classes as well, that whether it is pauciarticular, whether it is polyarticular, or whether it is Still's disease, the IOLs are always strictly contraindicated in the juvenile chronic arthritis or the rheumatoid arthritis, especially in the young patients, because the chances of rejection, the chances of fibrosis, the reaction are very, very high, and that is why removing the IOL is a very good option in cases of PCO in these patients. So let us try to look for the other question now. The other question is, a 18 months child comes with the eye deviated medially. So there is a convergent squint. So what should be the first step in the management? If you remember, I always say that you have to always go in a particular order. That particular order is very, very important when you are treating the squint, because you have to first treat the main root cause and then you have to go for the further treatments. Now if you see the options here, they have given the forced duction test, which cannot be the answer. Forced duction test is usually done in cases of the restrictive variety of squint, where we actually have the pseudo squint. Pseudo squint, like for example, that is found in cases of the blowout fractures also, where there is actually mechanical restriction of the muscles and there is no true paralysis of the nerve or the muscles. So you don't have to do the forced duction test. Second is examination under anesthesia, not required. What you want to do with anesthesia? We actually want to treat the cause of the squint. Cause of the squint is actually the amblyopia. And what is the cause of amblyopia? The patient is not able to see for a very long time. So if there is low vision for a very long time due to any reason, eye will go into amblyopia, and once the eye is going into amblyopia, there is a tendency of deviation. So what do you want to see? The cause of low vision. And what is the most common cause of low vision in India? Undoubtedly the uncorrected refractive errors. So what you want to do is actually this one. We want to do the refractive error testing, and side by side also do the fundus examination. Other thing is cover uncover test. This is actually done for the latent squint. Latent squint or the heterophorias, where actually squint is kept latent, the squint is kept hidden due to fusion. So how can you break the fusion? If you break the fusion, the squint will manifest. We can actually break this fusion by covering one eye. Cover, then uncover. As soon as you cover the eye under the cover will go into deviation, and as you uncover, it will again come to central fixation, and by the direction of the movement of this eye, you will come to know that which type of squint the patient was having. So what should be your first step? The first step of the management will be the refractive error testing and the fundus examination. Now what are the other things actually that we can do? Now see the treatment of the latent squint. If the patient is having the latent squint, then your series of the treatment steps will be COPS. First C, then O, then P, and then S. Means you have to first do C. C is actually the correction of the refractive error. First do C, that is correction of refractive error, then do the O. O means the orthoptic exercises. Then we have to give the orthoptic exercises, call the patient on Synapto-4. You can give the exercises. Then we have to do the P. P means actually the prisms. These prisms are actually the angulated glasses. This also you can introduce in the specs, and their deviation, apex of the deviation should be the opposite direction of the squint in the patient. Suppose patient is having 15-degree convergent squint. So when you introduce the prisms, their apex should have a direction to the opposite side, that is towards outside. And finally we can do S. S means the surgery. Surgery is usually done after 4 to 5 years of age. Don't do surgery before this. And usually we can give two kind of surgeries. Either we can do resection surgery or we can do the recession surgery. Now what is the basic difference between the two types of surgeries? Resection actually means the shortening. Here we are doing the shortening of the extraocular muscle, while another is recession. Recession actually means the loosening of the extraocular muscle. When you are shortening the muscle, this will actually increase the power of the extraocular muscle, while when we are doing the recession will be decreasing the power of the extraocular muscle. So suppose you want to increase the power of any muscle. For example, a patient comes to us with the right eye divergent squint. Right eye divergent squint means there can be overaction of the lateral rectus, or there can be underaction of this medial rectus. If there is overaction of the lateral rectus, we can do the recession of the lateral rectus. If there is underaction of the medial rectus, we can do the resection of the medial rectus. Now if you see the next question, there was a question in which we can do the extended matching work. There was 4 options. On the left hand side there were 4 drugs: steroids, hydroxychloroquine, digoxin and amiodarone, while the options were optic neuropathies, yellow vision, retinopathy and the cataract. Now if you see here, everybody knows that steroids are always notorious for the cataract and glaucoma, and as I always give you that popular mnemonic GTCS, remember, generalized tonic clonic seizures. So what I always tell you, the topical steroids are causing more of the glaucoma, while the systemic steroids are causing more of the cataract. Then you should also know the type of glaucoma and the type of cataract. The type of glaucoma is actually the open angle type of glaucoma, while the type of cataract is the posterior subcapsular cataract. So that is why with the hydroxychloroquine you will go with the cataract, right? Then the amiodarone. Amiodarone is very notorious for causing the optic neuropathies. I will give you a long list which are actually important for causing the optic neuritis. This is called as the toxic optic neuropathy. The toxic optic neuropathy can be caused by a number of drugs. Like I said, that amiodarone is one of them, but apart from this it can be caused by the ethyl alcohol. Then it is also caused by the methyl alcohol, methyl alcohol. Then it is caused by the tobacco. It is caused by the digoxin. Even digoxin also causes, especially the digitalis. So it's better to write digitalis here, digitalis. Then we have even the ethambutol. Ethambutol also causes this. Then we have the chloroquine also. Now chloroquine is also given in the options, but because we have amiodarone also, that is why we have gone with the toxic optic neuritis with amiodarone, because with the chloroquine we also get a retinopathy, and that retinopathy is this one. This is called as the bull's eye retinopathy. This is actually the bullseye retinopathy that we are getting by the chloroquine, and chloroquine is actually most notorious for causing this bullseye retinopathy. Here we get this hyperpigmented area, then we get a hypopigmented area, and then again we get a hyperpigmented area. This is called as the bullseye retinopathy. So if you see the options here, we have the chloroquine with retinopathy, then we have amiodarone with the optic neuritis, the hydrocortisone, that is a steroid with the cataract, and you are also left with digoxin with yellow vision. Yellow vision, one of the very important causes of yellow vision is actually the digoxin due to this inhibition. It occurs due to the inhibition of the sodium pump. This gives a yellow colored cataract due to the filtering effect. Now the next important question, they have asked you the first order neurons, and like I always say, first order neurons are not the rods and cones. Rods and cones are just the photoreceptors, the first cells that actually accept the light. Now from these rods and cones, the light will go actually to the bipolar cells, and these bipolar cells are actually the first order neurons, and from these bipolar cells it will go to the optic nerve, which contains the second order neurons. Optic nerve contains which cells? The ganglionic cells, and therefore they will form the second order neurons, and from these ganglionic cells the optic nerves neurons will actually synapse in the lateral geniculate body, and this will form actually the third order neurons. So rods and cones are the photoreceptors, then are the first order cells, second order cells, and third order cells in the order of bipolar cells, the ganglionic cells, and the lateral geniculate body. The lateral geniculate body, as you know, consists of the 6 layers. So another important question is on the lateral geniculate body. As I always say that neuro-ophthalmology is one of the important topic ever asked in the AIIMS. They always ask you, like this time they have asked you the RAPD also, they have asked you about the lateral geniculate body also, so about this neurons also, and that is why the next expected question is on this lateral geniculate body. It consists of actually the 6 layers which are numbered 1 to 6. Now what happens, the layers 1, 4 and 6, the layers 1, 4 and 6, they actually receive the input. They receive the input from the contralateral hemiretina, while the layers 2, 3 and 5, they receive the input from the ipsilateral hemiretina. Now what is the meaning of actually the contralateral and what is the meaning of the ipsilateral? Contralateral means opposite side, while 2, 3, 5, these layers receive from the same side. They receive from the same side. Similarly, you have got 2 important pathways also. The 2 important pathways of the lateral geniculate body. The 2 important pathways are, one is the magnocellular pathway and another is the parvocellular pathway. Magno is formed by the layers 1 and 2 and parvo is made by layers 3 to 6. Now magnocellular pathway consists of the large cells while the parvocellular consists of the small cells. So if you see the function, this is concerned with actually the movement, the depth as well as the flickering, movement, depth and the flickering, while the small cells are concerned with the finer details. Fine details, it can be fine details like we can have shape, we can have the color, we can have the texture. So these are very important things regarding the lateral geniculate body. Whole of the neuro-ophthalmology, as you know, is an important topic for the AIIMS. Especially important was RAPD, again asked. Second important thing were the neurons, they are again asked, and that is why I think now the next important thing is the lateral geniculate body. Remember this very important thing. Thank you.